Default text chapter 1. Why failure is the most human thing we do. Failure is the one experience every human being shares in common. It cuts across time, culture, wealth, belief, and personality. To fail is not an anomaly. It is the default condition of learning, growing, and existing. And yet, despite its inevitability, we rarely examine failure with philosophical seriousness. We tend to treat it as something to hide, to avoid, to be ashamed of. But failure does not merely shape us, it reveals us. It uncovers who we are beneath expectations, appearances, and illusions. And in that sense, failure is more honest than success. When philosophers examined the foundations of meaning, value, knowledge, or identity, they always began with some kind of limitation. To be human is to be limited, and to be limited is to encounter failure. In this sense, failure is not the opposite of progress. It is the starting point of all progress. When we understand failure as the soil in which meaning grows, the entire concept transforms. It becomes something to interpret, not to escape. But the modern world treats failure as a personal defect rather than a natural condition. We worship productivity, celebrate efficiency, and idolize people who seem to have never failed. Yet, every one of these narratives is fiction. The biographies of great thinkers, creators, and leaders are held together by the glue of countless failures. We simply choose not to see them because we prefer a cleaner story. The truth is that anyone who has achieved anything significant has also failed more than most people ever attempt. This chapter sets the stage for a journey into the philosophy of failure not as a motivational slogan, but as a rigorous exploration of what it means to fall short, why falling short is necessary, and how the deepest insights in human history were born from moments when thinking, expectation, or identity broke down. Failure is not a step backward. It is a step inward. Failure is the one doorway through which every philosophy must eventually pass. We can discuss metaphysics, ethics, consciousness, or morality, but sooner or later we return to the question, what do we do when things do not go our way? What happens when the world contradicts our plans? What happens when we contradict ourselves? These are not side questions. They are central to the human condition. Most philosophical traditions begin with the assumption that humans are imperfect. They accept that our understanding is limited, our desires conflict, our bodies age, and our lives are short. Failure is woven into the structure of existence. And yet, this reality is emotional as well as intellectual. When we fail, we suffer. This suffering becomes an opportunity to see ourselves more clearly, and this clarity often becomes the gateway to growth. But growth does not begin with comfort. It begins with rupture. In daily life, we hide our failures behind humor, excuses, distractions, or silence. We fear being seen as inadequate. But philosophy asks us to move in the opposite direction. Instead of hiding failure, it invites us to examine it. Instead of fleeing discomfort, it asks us to experience it. And instead of treating failure as a verdict, philosophy reframes it as a question. Every failure asks something of us. Who are you now that your expectations collapsed? What do you believe now that your plans did not work? What remains when the facade disappears? This chapter positions failure not as a detour from a meaningful life, but as the very terrain on which meaning is built. We learn to walk by falling. We learn to think by being wrong. And we learn who we are by facing the moments when the image we created of ourselves is no longer sustainable. Failure is the beginning of authenticity. To fail is to be human, but it is also to be alive. Most of the time, we measure life by achievements, outcomes, victories, and successes. But these moments are rare. fleeting, and often fragile. What truly shapes us are the attempts, the risks we take, the experiments we try, the relationships we enter, the ambitions we chase, and every attempt carries within it the possibility of failure. This possibility is not a flaw, it is what makes the attempt meaningful. If everything succeeded automatically, nothing would feel significant. This is why failure is not merely an interruption of life. It is a signal that we are pushing against the boundaries of what we know or what we can do. A life without failure would be a life without challenge, without curiosity, and without growth. Failure, in this sense, is not the enemy of effort. It is the expression of effort. Understanding failure philosophically requires that we separate what happens from what we interpret it to mean. A failed plan is simply an outcome. The feeling of being a failure is a story we add to that outcome. The first is unavoidable. The second is optional. This distinction will become important in every chapter that follows. Failure is the most human thing we do. And it is also the most transformative. Chapter 2. Nietzsche, Failure as Rebirth of the Self. Nietzsche believed that the greatest individuals in history were not the ones who succeeded effortlessly, but the ones who could transform failure into strength. He argued that failure is not only expected but required for the development of a powerful, independent self. According to Nietzsche, comfort weakens us, certainty dulls us, and obedience suffocates us. But failure disrupts us. It fractures the comfortable illusions we cling to and forces us to confront the raw material of who we truly are. Nietzsche's concept of self-overcoming begins with the experience of collapse. Something breaks a belief, a plan, a relationship, a worldview, and the individual is left standing in the ruins. This moment is painful, disorienting, and often humiliating. Nietzsche's concept of self-overcoming begins with the experience of collapse. Something breaks a belief, a plan, a relationship, a worldview, and the individual is left standing in the ruins. This moment is painful, disorienting, and often humiliating. But Nietzsche's perspective is not gentle. He does not sugarcoat the emotional reality of failure. Instead, he asks us to embrace it directly. Pain, he says, is useful. Disappointment is information. Suffering is a catalyst. He famously wrote that what does not kill us can make us stronger, not because pain is inherently valuable, but because responding creatively to adversity develops depth, courage, and internal power. Strength is not given. It is forged in the heat of failure. In this sense, Nietzsche rejects the idea that failure diminishes a person. He believes failure reveals the portion of ourselves that we have not yet trained, understood, or developed. When we fail, we encounter a frontier. And frontiers are where growth happens. Nietzsche's heroes are not those who avoid failure. They are the ones who fail repeatedly, destructively, dramatically, and arise each time with a new understanding of who they are and what they can become. Nietzsche's view of failure is inseparable from his critique of herd morality. Social norms encourage conformity, predictability, and safety. But these values discourage risk, experimentation, and challenge. Nietzsche insists that anyone who wishes to live authentically must be willing to break away from the expectations of the crowd. And the moment we break away, we expose ourselves to the possibility of failure. The herd avoids failure because it avoids individuality. Those who choose to think for themselves must accept failure as the price of independence. In Nietzsche's framework, failure is also an expression of freedom. When you choose your own path, you lose the protective shield of convention. You have no one to blame, no script to follow, no guarantee of success. But this vulnerability is the beginning of power. Anyone can follow a path laid out by others. Only a free individual can fail by their own choices. Nietzsche would argue that failing in pursuit of your own values is infinitely more meaningful than succeeding in a life that is not yours. This leads to one of Nietzsche's most profound ideas, that failure is part of the creative process. Every form of creation, whether philosophical, artistic, scientific, or personal, requires confronting the unknown. The unknown contains possibility, but it also contains risk. When you create, you inevitably make mistakes, misjudge, and fall short. These failures are not signs that you should stop. They are signs that you are attempting something new. Nietzsche's life itself was filled with failures, rejection, illness, isolation, poverty, and misunderstanding. And yet, through these failures, he produced ideas that would transform modern thought. His philosophy is not hypothetical. It is experiential. He wrote from inside the experience of repeated collapse. His life is a case study in how failure can push a person toward deeper originality. The most important aspect of Nietzsche's relationship with failure is his insistence on reinterpretation. When a person fails, their instinct is to interpret the event in a negative, self-destructive way. Nietzsche argues that the interpretation matters more than the event. A failure can be seen as evidence of weakness or as proof that you are attempting something worthy of your potential. You can interpret failure as an ending. Nietzsche believed that the strongest individuals are the ones who reinterpret their failures in empowering ways. They take responsibility not to blame themselves, but to claim ownership of their lives. They refuse to be defined by the expectations of society or the judgments of others. They treat failure as raw material, shaping it into something meaningful. This process is not easy, but it is liberating. It turns suffering into strength and collapse into creation. To embrace failure in the Nietzschean way is to reject passivity. It is to actively engage with the challenges of life, rather than waiting for circumstances to improve. It is to choose courage over comfort, authenticity over conformity, and growth over stagnation. The individual who follows this path may experience more failures than the average person, but they will also live with more intensity, depth, and freedom. Nietzsche saw failure not as a barrier to greatness, but as the training ground for it. And in this training ground, every collapse becomes an invitation to rise in a new form. The self is rebuilt in the ruins. Failure is the furnace in which identity is reforged. Chapter 3. Kierkegaard. Failure as the anxiety of Cho. Kierkegaard believed that the deepest form of failure is not the failure of results, but the failure of becoming oneself. For him, the human being is always suspended between possibilities. We are creatures of choice, and because every choice eliminates countless alternatives, every choice contains the seed of regret. His is where failure begins, not in what goes wrong, but in the weight of what could have been. The more possibilities a person has, the heavier the burden becomes. Kierkegaard called this weight anxiety, and he believed that anxiety is the birthplace of authentic ecstasy. Failure, in Kierkegaard's view, is fundamentally tied to freedom. A bird or a machine cannot fail. They merely function as they are designed to function. But humans are not determined by fixed instincts or mechanical programming. We must choose who we will become, and in choosing, we expose ourselves to the risk of choosing wrongly. This is why Kierkegaard said, anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. When we stand on the edge of possibility, we feel both empowered and terrified. Failure is baked into this condition. For Kierkegaard, the tragedy of modern life is not that people fear the leap is terrifying precisely because it exposes the individual to the possibility of collapse. If you choose a relationship, it can fall apart. If you choose a career, it can fail. If you choose a belief, you may later realize you were wrong. Every leap is a confrontation with the truth that life does not provide certainty. But certainty is an illusion anyway. The person who demands certainty before acting will never act at all. And this inaction becomes its own form of suffocating failure. For Kierkegaard, the worst failures are not external. They are internal failures, failures of conviction, failures of courage, failures to stand in one's own truth. A person can achieve wealth, status, and admiration, and still fail at the task of becoming themselves. Conversely, a person may lose everything externally, yet succeed if they live with integrity, passion, and commitment. Failure, in this sense, is not something the world gives us. It is something we define through our relationship to choice. Kierkegaard believed that the self is not a static object, but an ongoing task. You do not find yourself. You must choose yourself. And choosing yourself requires accepting the inevitability of mistakes. A self built on the fear of failure will collapse the moment difficulty arises. But a self built through courageous choices becomes resilient, deep, and authentic. This is why anxiety, though uncomfortable, is essential. It signals that you are standing before a real choice. Where Nietzsche saw failure as the birthplace of strength, Kierkegaard saw it as the birthplace of sincerity. When a person fails, the illusion of perfection falls away. The ego cracks. Pretenses break. And in this vulnerable space, a person finds a clearer view of who they are and who they want to become. This vulnerability is not weakness. It is the foundation of inner honesty. Kierkegaard believed that most people live behind masks. Not literal masks, but social ones. They present a version of themselves shaped by expectations, norms, and appearances. They play roles rather than showing their true thoughts and desires. Failure shatters these masks. It puts a person into direct contact with their inner life because failure makes pretense unsustainable. When a person experiences heartbreak, humiliation, rejection, or collapse, they stop pretending that everything is fine. They begin to feel the raw emotions that modern life teaches us to avoid. Sadness, fear, longing, uncertainty. These emotions hurt, but they are real, and Kierkegaard believed that entering this arena of inner emotion is the only way to live authentically. This solitude is not a flaw. It is the condition of freedom. To choose for yourself is to stand apart from the crowd. It is to say, I will live my life, not the life assigned to me. But this independence requires confronting fear of being wrong. Fear of judgment, fear of collapse. Most people prefer to avoid this fear by following ready-made paths. These paths feel safer because the responsibility is externalized. If the path fails, they can blame society, culture, or circumstance. But Kierkegaard believed this safety comes at a price. The loss of oneself. Failure, then, is not merely something that happens when choices go wrong. Failure is also what happens when people refuse to choose for themselves. A person who always chooses the safe option, or the socially approved option, may feel secure, but they suffer a deeper existential failure. They fail to take responsibility for their own life. And this failure ultimately leads to despair. Despair, in Kierkegaard's philosophy, is the sickness of a self that cannot reconcile who it is with what it desires to be. Despair is not sadness. It is the quiet, persistent awareness that the life you are living is not fully yours. And the cure for despair is not success, but commitment, the decision to leap into authenticity. Even when the outcome is uncertain. Kierkegaard believed that failure teaches us something essential about identity, that identity is fragile, dynamic, and constantly evolving. When people cling too tightly to a fixed idea of who they are supposed to be, Failure feels catastrophic. It shatters the illusion of stability. But this shattering is necessary. It reveals that the self is not something to protect. It is something to develop. This insight is vital for anyone who struggles with perfectionism. Perfectionism is not the commitment to excellence, Kierkegaard would say. It is the fear of failure disguised as virtue. Perfectionists avoid risks, avoid change, avoid vulnerability, and avoid choices that might expose them to imperfection. But this avoidance prevents growth. A perfectionist may achieve many external successes, but internally they feel trapped, anxious, and incomplete. The pursuit of perfection becomes a cage. In contrast, embracing the possibility of failure liberates the self. When you accept that mistakes are inevitable, you grant yourself permission to choose boldly. You begin to see life as a series of experiments rather than performances. You stop trying to control outcomes and start focusing on intention. And in doing so, you step into the flow of genuine existence. Kierkegaard's philosophy reveals a paradox. The more a person tries to avoid failure, the more they guarantee it. But the person who accepts failure as part of the human condition becomes capable of living with passion and authenticity. Failure becomes not an enemy, but a companion on the path to becoming oneself. Chapter 4: Camus, Failure and the Absurd. For Albert Camus, failure is not an occasional event. It is the structural condition of being alive in a world that does not provide inherent meaning. Camus argued that humans have a fundamental desire for clarity, purpose, and order, yet the universe remains silent. We seek answers, but the world does not respond. This mismatch between the mind that longs for meaning and the world that offers none is what Camus called the absurd, and within the absurd, failure is unavoidable. Because, no matter how perfectly we plan our lives, reality will always defy our expectations. Camus insisted that the absurd is not a philosophical conclusion, but an emotional experience. It is the feeling that arises when life contradicts our plans, when outcomes are random, when tragedy strikes without reason, or when success feels hollow. This is why failure hits so deeply. It exposes the gap between our hopes and the world as it actually is. Failure makes the absurd visible. It reminds us that life cannot be controlled, predicted, or fully understood. And yet, Camus argued, this confrontation is the beginning of freedom. For Camus, the problem is not that failure exists, the problem is how humans respond to it. Many people respond by clinging to illusions, illusions of control, illusions of destiny, illusions of cosmic justice. They want the world to make sense. They want their efforts to guarantee results. They want life to reward them for their intentions. But the absurd shatters these expectations. Camus believed that the key to a meaningful life is not eliminating failure, but learning to live with it deliberately and defiantly. But the absurd shatters these expectations. Camus believed that the key to a meaningful life is not eliminating failure, but learning to live with it deliberately and defiantly. Camus' most iconic metaphor for failure is Sisyphus, the mythic figure condemned to push a boulder uphill for eternity, only to watch it roll back down every time. The task is repetitive, painful, and without reward. On the surface, it appears to be the ultimate representation of failure, life defined by futility. But Camus interprets the myth differently. He argues that Sisyphus becomes free when he recognizes the truth of his condition and chooses to embrace it without hope for escape. The moment Sisyphus accepts that the boulder will always fall, failure loses its power over him. He is no longer a victim of his task. He becomes the master of it. His strength lies not in achieving success, but in choosing his attitude toward the inevitable. Camus concludes the essay with the famous line, "We must imagine Sisyphus happy, not because his struggle became easier, but because he transformed its meaning." Camus believed this is what humans must do with failure. We must stop expecting the world to behave according to our ideals. We must stop interpreting failure as proof that life is unfair or that we are inadequate. Instead, we must recognize that the world is indifferent, not hostile. Failure is not a message from the universe. It is simply the natural outcome of living in a chaotic, unpredictable environment. And once we accept this, we become free to act without fear. This does not mean we should become apathetic. Camus hated apathy. He believed that action becomes more meaningful precisely because it is uncertain. If we cannot control outcomes, then our courage, our effort, and our persistence matter even more. Failure becomes the backdrop against which human willpower shines the brightest. Camus' most iconic metaphor for failure is Sisyphus, the mythic figure condemned to push a boulder uphill for eternity, only to watch it roll back down every time. The task is repetitive, painful, and without reward. On the surface, it appears to be the ultimate representation of failure, life defined by futility. One of Camus' most powerful ideas is that failure is not personal. The universe does not target individuals. Life simply unfolds. This realization can be both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because it means no one is coming to save us. Liberating because it means we are free to define ourselves. Failure becomes less intense when we stop interpreting it as a cosmic message. Sometimes things fail not because we were wrong, but because the world is bigger than our plans. Camus believed that accepting the absurd creates emotional resilience. When you stop demanding that life reward your effort, disappointment loses its sting. You become grounded, stable, centered. You stop blaming yourself for outcomes beyond your control. And paradoxically, this acceptance makes success sweeter because it is no longer expected, it is earned. Camus' philosophy suggests that the worst type of failure is not the failure of effort, but the failure of imagination. When people become trapped in rigid expectations about how life should unfold, they become fragile. They break easily. But when people expand their imagination, when they allow life to surprise them, challenge them, and contradict them, they become adaptable. They develop a flexible strength. In this sense, failure is not an interruption, but a teacher. It forces a person to rethink their approach, question their assumptions, and re-examine their motivations. Camus believed that this questioning is the root of philosophy itself. A philosopher is someone who does not accept the world as given, but confronts it with curiosity. And failure is the trigger that activates this curiosity. Camus also argued that failure exposes the difference between hope and courage. Hope waits for things to get better. Courage acts whether or not they will. The person who relies on hope is vulnerable to despair because their emotional stability depends on outcomes. But the person who relies on courage is stable, even in defeat. They understand that life is valuable, not because it guarantees success, but because it allows participation. This is why Camus believed that living well is not about avoiding failure. It is about refusing to be defined by it. A person who continues to act despite uncertainty becomes larger than their circumstances. They embody what Camus called the rebel. Someone who says yes to life even when life does not explain itself. Camus' perspective provides a crucial insight. Failure is universal. Everyone experiences it, from the most talented to the most ordinary. But only some people learn how to transform failure into wisdom. According to Camus, this transformation begins with honesty about the limits of control. the unpredictability of life, and the absence of guarantees. When a person becomes honest in this way, they stop living reactively. They stop interpreting success and failure as judgments on their worth. They begin to live deliberately. This shift in mindset allows a person to endure setbacks without losing themselves. They become capable of what Camus described as lucid living, a life lived with eyes open, without illusions. This lucidity does not eliminate pain, but prevents pain from becoming despair. It allows a person to hold failure lightly, not as a verdict, but as part of the human condition. Camus emphasized that meaning emerges through continuous engagement with life, not through achieving specific goals. To engage with life is to expose oneself to failure. But this exposure is also what creates depth. A life without failure would be shallow, repetitive, and unearned. Failure gives texture to achievement and significance to perseverance. Camus concluded that we do not need to escape the absurd, we need to confront it. And in confronting it, we discover a form of heroic resilience. The hero of the absurd is not the person who conquers the world, but the person who continues to push the boulder with dignity and awareness. In this confrontation, failure becomes a companion rather than an enemy, and life becomes an artistic act of defiance. Chapter 5: Eastern Wisdom. Failure as Impermanence. Eastern philosophy offers a radically different interpretation of failure, one that dissolves the concept itself. In many Eastern traditions, the idea of failure is inseparable from the idea of impermanence. Everything changes, everything rises and falls, everything grows and decays. Because of this, no event, outcome, disappointment, or success can define a life permanently. Failure becomes just one temporary shape that existence takes before shifting into another. The suffering we attach to failure is often the result of misunderstanding life's natural movement. Buddhist philosophy teaches that all suffering originates from attachment to expectations, attachment to outcomes, attachment to identities. When we cling to an expectation that something must work a certain way, failure feels catastrophic. But the catastrophe does not come from the event. It comes from the clinging. When a person learns to loosen their grip on rigid expectations, the emotional intensity of failure dissolves. The event remains, but the interpretation becomes softer, more spacious, more accepting. In this context, failure is not a personal flaw but a reminder of impermanence. It is a signal that conditions have changed, that a certain approach no longer matches reality, or that the time has come to pivot. Rather than punishing us, failure nudges us back into alignment with the present moment. It invites us to observe what is, rather than forcing what we think should be. A person who embraces impermanence stops treating failure as an ending, and starts treating it as a transition. This perspective allows humans to move through life with fluidity. When we stop expecting permanence, we stop panicking when things break. When we stop demanding consistency from an inconsistent world, we stop taking setbacks personally. Eastern wisdom teaches that failing is not falling apart, it is participating in the natural rhythm of change. Taoist philosophy takes this even further. In Taoism, the most powerful force in the world is the one that yields. Water flows around obstacles instead of colliding with them. It adapts without losing itself. It moves with the natural shape of things, not against them. Failure, from a Taoist viewpoint, occurs when a person resists the flow, when they cling too tightly to a direction that no longer matches reality. To live in accordance with the Tao is to recognize that not every effort must result in victory. Sometimes the wisest action is to step back, wait, or shift direction. Taoism reframes failure not as a blow to one's identity, but as feedback about the environment. When something does not work, the Taoist does not interpret it as personal defeat. They interpret it as a sign to redirect their energy. This is not giving up, it is realignment. Where Western culture often glorifies relentless effort, Taoism values effortless action, moving with clarity, intuition, and timing. If an attempt fails, it may simply mean the moment was not right. The river of life was flowing in a different direction. The Taoist understands that outcomes are influenced by timing, context, and countless forces beyond our control. This understanding reduces ego and increases adaptability, making the individual far more resilient. Failure becomes less dramatic. It becomes part of the dance, part of the rhythm, part of the flow. And when a person learns to flow, setbacks stop feeling like personal attacks and start feeling like guidance. Zen Buddhism offers another powerful angle, the idea that the self is not a solid, fixed structure. When people believe their identity is permanent, failure threatens their sense of self. They think, if I fail, I am a failure. But Zen dismantles this idea by showing that the self is a collection of changing thoughts, emotions, habits, and perceptions. Since the self is fluid, failure cannot define it. Zen masters often teach through paradox. They encourage students to embrace not knowing, to see mistakes as gateways to insight, and to remain fully present during moments of confusion or disappointment. Zen does not ask the practitioner to eliminate failure, but to observe it without resistance. When failure is observed without judgment, it loses its emotional weight. It becomes just another passing moment in consciousness. This perspective liberates a person from the fear of inadequacy. Mistakes become opportunities to wake up. Missteps become lessons in awareness. The Zen practitioner begins to understand that failure is not something happening to them, it is part of the unfolding of reality. With this understanding, life becomes less about achievement and more about presence. And presence cannot fail. To live in accordance with the Tao is to recognize that not every effort must result in victory. Sometimes the wisest action is to step back, wait, or shift direction. Taoism reframes failure not as a blow to one's identity, but as feedback about the environment. When something does not work, the Taoist does not interpret it as personal defeat. They interpret it as a sign to redirect their energy. This is not giving up, it is realignment. In many Eastern traditions, failure is not a deviation from the path. It is part of the path itself. A seed must break before it can grow. A wave must fall before it can rise again. A mistake must occur before wisdom can emerge. Life unfolds in cycles, not straight lines. When we understand this, failure becomes less threatening. It becomes a natural stage in a larger process. Eastern wisdom encourages patience. Instead of expecting immediate results, it invites us to trust the unfolding. Something that appears to be a failure today may reveal itself as a blessing years later. Something that collapses may create space for something new. The Eastern approach offers a quiet confidence, the belief that life has a rhythm, and that every downturn is followed by a new beginning. This perspective does not deny the pain of failure. It recognizes it, accepts it, and allows it to pass through. Because everything passes, Eastern philosophy teaches that suffering intensifies when we hold on, and it softens when we let go. By accepting impermanence, a person gains emotional mobility. They no longer become stuck in what went wrong. They move with life, not against it. Failure, then, becomes a teacher of humility, patience, and non-attachment. It becomes an invitation to deepen one's understanding of reality and to participate in the natural currents of existence. It becomes part of the practice of being human. Chapter 6: Psychology, the science of why we break. While philosophy gives us frameworks to interpret failure, psychology explains why failure affects us so deeply. From a psychological standpoint, failure is powerful because it threatens basic human needs: the need for belonging, the need for competence, and the need for identity. When something we attempt collapses, the emotional reaction is not just disappointment, it is the fear that something essential about ourselves has been exposed. To live in accordance with the Tao is to recognize that not every effort must result in victory. Sometimes the wisest action is to step back, wait, or shift direction. Taoism reframes failure not as a blow to one's identity, but as feedback about the environment. When something does not work, the Taoist does not interpret it as personal defeat. They interpret it as a sign to redirect their energy. This is not giving up, it is realignment. One of the most important insights in modern psychology is that humans interpret events through cognitive filters. These filters determine whether failure feels like a temporary setback or a fatal flaw. People with a fixed mindset believe their abilities are static, so failure feels like proof that they are not good enough. People with a growth mindset believe abilities can be developed, so failure feels like information. The event is the same, the interpretation changes everything, but mindset alone does not explain the full weight of failure. Humans also create internal narratives about themselves. These narratives form our self-concept. When we tie our worth to success, failure becomes a direct attack on identity. When we tie our worth to effort, learning, or values, failure becomes less damaging. The story we tell about failure determines whether it becomes trauma or transformation. Self-doubt amplifies the psychological pain of failure. When a person already feels insecure, any setback can confirm their worst fears about themselves. But confidence is not the absence of doubt. It is the ability to act despite doubt. The most resilient individuals are not those who never question themselves. They are the ones who learn to recognize their doubts without obeying them. Another factor that shapes our experience of failure is social comparison. Humans constantly compare themselves to others, especially in a world dominated by curated images of success. This comparison creates unrealistic expectations. When people judge themselves against what others display rather than who they truly are, they magnify the sting of failure. Psychologists call this comparison distortion, a cognitive trap that makes personal setbacks feel catastrophic. Psychology also shows that humans tend to overestimate how long failure will affect them. This is known as impact bias. When people imagine a failure, they believe the emotional impact will last much longer than it actually will. But the human mind is far more resilient than we think. We adapt quickly. Most failures hurt intensely at first, then fade into the background as new experiences replace them. From a psychological perspective, one of the biggest misunderstandings is thinking that failure diminishes us. In reality, well-structured failure strengthens us. Experiences that challenge us often create new neural pathways, teach emotional regulation, and build resilience. Psychologists refer to this as adversarial growth, the phenomenon where individuals become stronger, wiser, and more empathetic after adversity. However, not all failures produce growth automatically. Growth occurs when a person processes the failure constructively. This requires reflection, honesty, emotional regulation, and the ability to distinguish between the event and the self. People who blame themselves excessively or suppress their emotions often remain stuck. But those who examine the failure, understand its causes, and take ownership of their response become more capable. Attachment theory also explains why failure in relationships is so painful. Humans are wired to seek connection. When a relationship ends, or when we disappoint someone we love, it triggers deep primal fears of abandonment, inadequacy, or loss. These fears can distort our perception, making small failures feel enormous. But understanding the psychological roots of these reactions helps us respond more compassionately to ourselves. The science is clear. Humans are more resilient than they realize. Failure hurts because it challenges our identity, triggers evolutionary fear responses, and activates emotional memories. But failure also activates the mechanisms of growth. It forces adaptation. It reshapes neural pathways. It develops emotional intelligence. Psychologically, failure is one of the most powerful catalysts for long-term development. Understanding this gives us agency. Instead of being crushed by failure, we can learn to work with it. We can train our minds to interpret setbacks constructively. We can shift our narratives. We can regulate our emotions. We can use failure as raw material for psychological maturity. And in doing so, we become stronger, not in spite of our wounds, but through them. Failure reshapes the way we see ourselves long before it reshapes our future. At the core of every collapse, whether public humiliation or private disappointment, lies a shock to identity. We don't just fail at something. We feel as if we become the failure itself. And this is where psychology begins its long conversation with our inner world. The self is fragile because it is built on stories. When a story breaks, so do we. Alfred Adler argued that every human being carries a private logic, an internal narrative about what success means and what worth requires. Failure threatens this narrative, and that threat often hurts more than the event itself. When we fall short, the mind interprets it as evidence of inadequacy, even when the world doesn't. This inner distortion can be so powerful that a small setback becomes a personal catastrophe. But Adler also believed something else, that failure reveals the very story that needs correction. It exposes the unrealistic superiority drives, the hidden inferiority complexes, and the mistaken ideal of perfection. In this sense, failure is diagnostic. It tells us where the self is cracked. The moment we understand this, failure stops being an enemy. It becomes a mirror. A harsh mirror, maybe, but a truthful one. And truth, no matter how unwanted, is the starting point of psychological growth. Carl Jung went further. He believed that failure is one of the few events strong enough to force the ego to confront the shadow, the part of us we deny, reject, or refuse to acknowledge. Success inflates the ego, failure punctures it. And in that collapse, everything we've hidden floods into view. This confrontation is painful, but Jung insisted it is necessary for individuation, the process of becoming a whole person. The shadow contains both darkness and potential. Our aggression, fear, envy, and shame live there, but so do our suppressed talents, unlived passions, and ignored possibilities. Failure brings these contents upward. You feel humiliated, yes, but you also glimpse truths about yourself that daily routines keep buried. This is why some people emerge from failure with a radical change of direction. Jung would say they have integrated a piece of their shadow, something previously unclaimed. They didn't become someone new. They finally acknowledged who they were. Failure, therefore, is not simply a psychological event. It's an initiation of forced encounter with your full self. Modern psychology adds another layer. Cognitive biases distort our experience of failure. One of the most toxic is catastrophizing the belief that one failure predicts permanent ruin. Another is personalizationist, Assuming the failure defines your entire identity. These distortions make failure feel fatal even when it is trivial in the long arc of a life. But research on resilience shows something encouraging. People who reinterpret failure, rather than avoid it, develop stronger emotional stability. The key is cognitive reframing, the act of redefining the meaning of an event. Instead of "I failed because I'm insufficient," the frame shifts to "I failed because I'm learning something difficult." Same event, different identity impact. This is why reframing is powerful. The story you attach to failure determines whether you'll grow or collapse. Change the story, and the failure changes shape. It becomes a stepping stone, not a grave marker. And in neuroscience, this is backed by biology. The brain literally rewires when confronted with difficulty. Failure triggers a cascade of signals that increase learning, plasticity, and adaptation as long as the experience isn't shut down by shame. Shame is the emotional core of failure. Psychologists distinguish two types: guilt, "I did something wrong," and shame, "I am something wrong." Failure activates shame when the self is too tightly fused with the outcome. This fusion is why people avoid challenging tasks. The risk of being seen as inadequate feels unbearable. But research from Brené Brown shows that confronting shame with honesty dissolves its power. Speaking about failure breaks its isolation. Reflecting on failure turns chaos into understanding. Owning failure prevents it from owning you. This doesn't mean becoming indifferent to outcomes. It means understanding that outcomes do not define identity. Once this separation is made, a person becomes capable of extraordinary courage. They can attempt, risk, experiment, and dare again without fear of annihilation. And here lies the psychological paradox. The moment failure loses its terror, you gain the freedom to succeed. One of the most misunderstood findings in psychology is that resilience doesn't come from avoiding pain, it comes from moving through it. Children shielded from struggle grow into adults who fear it. Adults who voluntarily take on challenges develop a tolerance for discomfort that makes failure feel survivable, even useful. This is known as stress inoculation. Just as vaccines expose the body to a weakened threat, life exposes the mind to small failures that build psychological immunity. Each disappointment, each frustration, each imperfect attempt strengthens a person's capacity to endure future trials. But if someone avoids all risk, they never build this immunity. They collapse at the first sign of difficulty, because they never learned that difficulty is not fatal. Their self remains fragile, a thin shell, protecting an untested identity. So the presence of failure in your life isn't a sign that something is wrong. It's a sign that something is being built. Where, then, does meaning arise? Viktor Frankl believed that suffering becomes meaningful when the person chooses a courageous attitude toward it. Failure, like suffering, becomes meaningful when it transforms your understanding of yourself or your purpose. This attitude doesn't eliminate pain, it elevates it. It turns failure from an obstacle into a teacher. And like all powerful teachers, it demands attention, humility, and sincerity. If you turn away, the lesson repeats. If you face it, the lesson evolves. Meaning emerges when you realize that failure is not a detour from life, it is part of the path itself. Without it, you cannot discover your limits, your values, or your inner architecture. The human psyche does not grow in safety. It grows in the cracks, storms, collapses, and reconstructions that failure forces upon it. Transformation rarely begins with clarity. It almost always begins with collapse. In stories, transformation looks heroic, but in real life it looks like confusion, fear, doubt, and a strange sense that the old version of you no longer fits. Failure is the event that cracks the shell. It breaks the illusion of stability and forces a deeper version of the self to emerge. This is why so many psychological breakthroughs happen after a major disappointment. The mind becomes flexible when its old assumptions no longer work. The ego is too stubborn when it feels in control. But failure removes that illusion. It forces a humility that becomes the starting point of wisdom. It is the emotional equivalent of being stripped, bare, uncomfortable, exposed, and honest. In this vulnerable state, a strange thing occurs. You begin to see yourself without distortion. The defenses you once relied on, excuses, denial, avoidance, stop protecting you. They collapse under the weight of reality. And in the silence that follows, you begin to recognize what truly matters, what no longer serves you, and what needs to change. Transformation is not about adding something new. It is about removing what prevents your potential from surfacing. Many spiritual traditions describe transformation as a kind of death. Not the death of the body, but the death of identity. The ego resists this death with all its strength, which is why failure feels unbearable. It threatens the version of yourself you've carefully constructed. But this symbolic death is the gateway to rebirth. Without it, the self remains trapped in patterns that no longer serve its growth. Buddhist psychology teaches that clinging is the root of suffering. We cling to our image, our past successes, our sense of control. When these attachments are shattered, we experience what Buddhists call ego death, a collapse of self-concept. But this collapse creates space. In that space, new patterns, new insights, and new forms of identity can arise. Similarly, in Stoic philosophy, failure is understood as an external event, different in itself. What matters is the interpretation. Rebirth occurs when interpretation changes, not when circumstances do. A person becomes stronger not by avoiding misfortune, but by mastering the meaning they assign to it. Transformation, therefore, is not triggered by success. It is triggered by the shock of losing who you thought you were. This rebirth often unfolds in stages. The first stage is disorientation. The old map of the world no longer makes sense. The second stage is confrontation, facing the truth about your limits, fears, and illusions. The third stage is reconstruction, where you slowly build a version of yourself that aligns with reality instead of fantasy. It is during reconstruction that people often discover latent strength. The stability they create now is not based on illusion or ego, but on awareness. They learn what they can endure, what they can change, and what they must accept. This knowledge becomes a deeper form of confidence, one rooted not in achievement but in resilience. During this phase, people frequently adopt new habits, new perspectives, and new relationships. They let go of roles that no longer fit and expectations that no longer serve them. This shedding is not a loss, it is a refinement. The self becomes sharper, more authentic, more aligned. Rebirth is not dramatic. It is slow, steady, and often quiet. But its effects are permanent. At the deepest level, failure forces a re-examination of purpose. Many people chase goals inherited from parents, culture, or society without questioning whether these goals align with their inner nature. Failure interrupts this unconscious momentum. It demands a pause. In that pause, purpose is clarified. Some discover that the path they were on was never theirs to begin with. Others realize they lacked the courage to pursue what they truly wanted. Failure exposes the truth. Purpose cannot be borrowed. It must be chosen. It must be earned. It must be confronted. Once purpose becomes self-generated rather than socially assigned, the entire emotional tone of life shifts. Stress becomes manageable. Effort becomes meaningful. Obstacles become part of the journey instead of threats to identity. Purpose discovered after failure is stronger than purpose inherited from success. Rebirth does not eliminate fear, but it changes its meaning. People who have rebuilt themselves after a collapse no longer see fear as a stop sign. They see it as a signal something important is at stake. Instead of retreating, they lean in. They understand that fear accompanies any path worth taking. This relationship with fear is one of the clearest signs of transformation. Before failure, fear controls the self. After failure, the self controls the fear. You respond with awareness instead of panic, curiosity instead of avoidance. You understand that fear is not an enemy but a companion. This shift expands your life. You take risks with intention. You experiment. You grow. You stop protecting yourself from disappointment because you trust your ability to recover from it. And this trust, this quiet confidence is the deeper gift that failure leaves behind. Freedom is a word people use casually, yet few ever experience it in its deeper form. Most people live trapped inside invisible psychological cages: fear of judgment, fear of disappointing others, fear of falling behind, fear of not being enough. Failure, paradoxically, is what breaks these cages. When the thing you feared most actually happens, and you're still standing, a strange kind of liberation appears. This liberation is not loud. It doesn't feel triumphant. It feels like emptiness at first, the collapse of expectations, illusions, and roles. But inside that emptiness lies possibility. When failure strips away the layers of performance, you are left with the raw truth of who you are. This truth is uncomfortable, but it is also the foundation of genuine freedom. Freedom begins the moment you no longer need to uphold a false version of yourself. It begins when the fear of being exposed loses its power. Most people spend their lives trying to avoid this moment. But those who have passed through it understand something profound. There is nothing left to hide. And a life without hiding is a life with room to breathe. One of the most transformative freedoms that failure provides is the freedom from perfectionism. Before we fail, perfection feels like a requirement. After we fail, we realize perfection was never real to begin with. It was a cage constructed by ego and maintained through anxiety. When failure dismantles that cage, imperfection becomes not a flaw, but a condition of being human. This shift is powerful. People who abandon perfectionism recover faster, create more, and take more risks. They understand that progress matters more than polish, and attempts matter more than outcomes. Success becomes a byproduct of action rather than fear-driven control. Once perfectionism dissolves, people stop waiting for the right moment. They stop hesitating. They stop rehearsing a life they never actually live. They begin moving, trying, failing again, and learning each time with less shame and more curiosity. This is the freedom of imperfection. You no longer need to be flawless to be worthy. Failure also frees people from external validation. When you fail, publicly or even privately, you confront the limits of seeking approval. You see how unstable it is, how inconsistent, how impossible to control. This realization breaks the addiction. Suddenly, the approval of others no longer determines your direction. You become motivated by internal alignment instead of external applause. This internal alignment is what psychologists call intrinsic motivation. It is driven by interest, meaning, or personal values. When someone shifts from extrinsic to intrinsic motivation, their entire relationship with effort changes. They work with intention, not anxiety. They act from authenticity, not performance. As validation loses its grip, People begin to choose paths that reflect who they truly are. They stop chasing trends, comparisons, and social expectations. This shift is subtle but life-changing. It replaces the fear of judgment with the desire for integrity. Freedom from validation means living a life that feels like your own. Another freedom born from failure is the freedom to experiment. Before failure, experimentation feels risky. Every attempt threatens your image. After failure, experimentation becomes natural. The worst-case scenario has already happened. Your image has already cracked. And now, nothing holds you back from trying again with openness instead of fear. People who embrace experimentation enter a different psychological mode, one of exploration. They test ideas, habits, careers, relationships, and creative paths. They stop assuming there is one correct route and begin discovering their own. This is the mindset that fuels innovation and personal growth. Experimentation is the opposite of stagnation. It turns life into a series of small adventures instead of a fixed script. And because experimentation naturally includes mistakes, people who have learned from failure are better equipped to navigate the unknown. This is the freedom to explore a life no longer ruled by the fear of being wrong. Failure also provides freedom from comparison. Before a collapse, comparison feels inevitable. We measure ourselves against peers, rivals, and strangers on the internet. But failure clarifies something crucial. Comparison was never real. It was a mental construct built to protect the ego. And when the ego collapses, comparison collapses with it. What remains is a quieter, more personal journey. You begin to realize that each life unfolds at its own pace, shaped by its own conditions and internal architecture. The idea of falling behind loses meaning. The idea of catching up dissolves. Success becomes relative to your path alone. This shift brings peace. It reduces anxiety, envy, and self-doubt. It grounds you in your own timeline instead of someone else's race. And once comparison no longer distracts you, clarity emerges, clarity about what you genuinely want instead of what you think you should want. Freedom from comparison makes room for authenticity. Finally, failure grants the freedom to begin again. Not reset, not return, but begin something entirely new, unburdened by the weight of the past. The self that emerges after failure is not the same self that entered it. You have more honesty, more self-knowledge, more resilience, and more clarity. You understand what you can survive, what you can change, and what you must let go of. Beginning again is not a step backward. It is a step forward with deeper roots. It is the act of rebuilding from understanding rather than illusion. It is the creation of a future designed by the person you've become, not the person you once pretended to be. This beginning does not require certainty. It requires courage and openness to possibility and a willingness to risk again. And because failure has already shown you that loss is survivable, courage becomes easier to access. This is the ultimate freedom failure offers. The freedom to create a life shaped not by fear, but by truth. Every journey that transforms a human life begins with a disruption. Success rarely creates depth. Comfort rarely creates character. It is failure unwanted, uninvited, unavoidable, that forces the self into confrontation with truth. And truth, even when painful, is the material from which strength, clarity, and meaning are built. Without failure, a person can live an entire life without ever meeting who they truly are. The greatest transformations rarely happen when life goes according to plan. They happen when the plan collapses. Because collapse forces reinvention. Collapse forces reflection. Collapse forces truth. and truth is the first ingredient of growth. Failure is not the opposite of success. Failure is the foundation of it. All of these perspectives point toward the same insight. Failure is not an interruption of the path. It is the path. It is the refining fire that burns away the unnecessary and tempers the essential. It is the chisel that shapes character, the storm that strengthens resilience, the mirror that reveals the truth hidden beneath ego. We don't grow when everything goes right. We grow when we are forced to question everything we thought we knew. We grow when something breaks and we must decide what to build in its place. This is the paradox of human development. The moments that hurt the most often become the moments that matter the most. By now, one thing is clear. Failure is not simply an event, but an invitation. An invitation to rebuild your identity, to rethink your values, to confront your fears, to understand your mind, to discover your purpose, to live more honestly, courageously, and freely. People fear failure because they mistake it for finality. But failure is never final unless you decide it is. It is not the grave of your potential. It is the birthplace of it. It is not the end of your story. It is the end of the chapter that needed to end. The next page remains blank, waiting for the version of you that failure has sharpened. Every journey that transforms a human life begins with a disruption. Success rarely creates depth. Comfort rarely creates character. It is failure unwanted, uninvited, unavoidable, that forces the self into confrontation with truth. And truth, even when painful, is the material from which strength, clarity, and meaning are built. Without failure, a person can live an entire life without ever meeting who they truly are. Failure exposes illusions, breaks false identities, and dissolves the mental constructs that keep people confined. It strips away the layers of performance long enough for authenticity to emerge. In the moment, it feels like loss. But in hindsight, it becomes a turning point. The moment the old self died, and the new self opened its eyes for the first time. The greatest transformations rarely happen when life goes according to plan. They happen when the plan collapses. Because collapse forces reinvention. Collapse forces reflection. Collapse forces truth. And truth is the first ingredient of growth. Failure is not the opposite of success. Failure is the foundation of it. Across psychology, philosophy, and spirituality, one theme repeats: the self must be shaken to awaken. Nietzsche believed that becoming who you are requires a confrontation with suffering. Jung insisted that individuation begins when the ego fails. Frankl taught that meaning emerges in the struggle, not the comfort. The Stoics argued that misfortune is the training ground for virtue. We don't grow when everything goes right. We grow when we are forced to question everything we thought we knew. We grow when something breaks and we must decide what to build in its place. This is the paradox of human development. The moments that hurt the most often become the moments that matter the most. By now, one thing is clear. Failure is not simply an event, but an invitation. An invitation to rebuild your identity, to rethink your values, to confront your fears, to understand your mind, to discover your purpose, to live more honestly, courageously, and freely. People fear failure because they mistake it for finality. But failure is never final unless you decide it is. It is not the grave of your potential. It is the birthplace of it. It is not the end of your story. It is the end of the chapter that needed to end. The next page remains blank, waiting for the version of you that failure has sharpened. Once you understand this, failure loses its weight. It becomes something you can face without panic, absorb without shame, and rise from without hesitation. You realize that failure doesn't define you. Your response to it does. And in choosing that response, you choose who you become. A free life is not a life without failure. It is a life where failure no longer terrifies you, where the fear of judgment no longer dictates your choices, where the collapse of one path does not destroy your sense of worth, where experimentation becomes natural, where purpose becomes internal, where comparison fades, where authenticity grows. This freedom is the ultimate gift of failure. It is not glamorous, it is not comfortable, but it is real. It is the kind of freedom that allows you to breathe without pretending, to move without apologizing, and to rebuild without shame. It is the freedom to live a life that is genuinely yours. When you understand failure not as a threat, but as a companion, you no longer walk through life cautiously. You walk with courage. You begin things you might once have avoided. You face things you once would have run from. You trust yourself in ways you never could before. You become, finally, fully alive. So the choice stands before you now. Avoid failure and remain unchanged, or face failure and evolve. One path is safe but stagnant. The other is uncertain but transformative. The people who shape the world, who leave an impact, who build meaningful lives, they choose the second path. Not because they enjoy pain, but because they understand what pain produces. The future belongs to those who dare. Those who embrace the risk of imperfection. Those who allow themselves to fall, learn, adjust, and rise again. Those who understand that the most important things in life, growth, resilience, authenticity, purpose, cannot exist without failure. You don't need to wait for confidence. You don't need to wait for perfection. You don't need to wait for the right moment. You only need to begin with full awareness that failure may come, and full confidence that it will shape you if it does. This is the quiet truth that sits at the center of every meaningful human life. Failure is not the price of becoming yourself. Failure is the process.